Hey guys, welcome to another video. In this one, we wanted to kind of go back and revisit a video that we did years ago. We've learned a lot since then, and we just kind of wanted to, update you guys and bring a little bit more to the table. So let's just get right into it. We have a lot to cover. For anyone following along with our channel, with all of our resin reviews, you may wonder why we're talking about mold making at all. In this modern age of 3D printing and CNC mills and lasers and all that other stuff, why are we bothering with this at all? Some of the castable resins that we are reviewing definitely excel in certain areas. Some of them, there are very few of them by the way, print perfectly and they cast perfectly, but more often than not we find resins that are easy to print with, but they don't cast so well, or maybe they cast really, really well, but they definitely take another level of skill, or they're a little bit harder to print with. Manufacturers are advancing resins to the point where it's very, very difficult to actually tell the difference between a injection and a 3D model. In some cases, the 3D models are actually much better. But there is something to be said about the speed of working with injection molds, and also having a physical copy on hand, especially when it comes to working in a more fast-paced environment. Sometimes a client will just email in, they'll say, hey, I need one of those things, and you can just inject it and it's done. Versus if you just have 3D models, you may have to put one piece on the build plate, it takes a couple hours. It just becomes a little bit less worth it when it comes to the speed aspect. So these are just a few of the reasons that I can think of off the top of my head for why molding in general is still relevant. In this video, we're gonna focus on these two different materials in the molding space. This one is vulcanized rubber, and this one is RTV. They do very much the same thing in the end, but they take two very separate paths to get to that place. So what does vulcanized rubber have over this one, or over the RTV space, that you can't find anywhere else? Well, for starters, vulcanized rubber lasts a very long time. These molds are very durable, they're very flexible, and above all, you can actually customize them heavily. What I started off with was this stuff. This is from a company called Castaldo. Actually, most of this stuff is from Castaldo. This is called No Shrink Pink, and as the name suggests, it has a very, very low shrinkage rate, which is definitely a factor when it comes to molding. But due to the fact that Castaldo, the company, sold and is now moving overseas to be closer to the source of rubber, which is actually in Thailand, this stuff has become a little bit scarce. Now that supply chain is expected to come back within the next couple of months, but I decided I wanted to have a little bit more rubber on hand in case of clients needing stuff. So we actually got this other stuff here. This one, now they all look the same, mind you. This one is their white label, and this one is actually very stiff. They come in these big strips. This is a box of 5 pounds of rubber in these strips, and what you do is just cut them to shape into your mold frame. This is a very typical size. As you can see, the rubber is actually pretty much the same width. And then underneath we have this one. This is called gold label. It looks very much the same to the white label. It's just a slightly different color. Gold label has a much higher concentration of natural gum rubber, which means that it's much more flexible. So the white is stiff, gold is very springy and flexible, pink doesn't shrink, haha, and it's actually a little bit more on the stiff side. And then one that I don't have is called titanium, and that one's like a step above white. That one's very, very stiff. So that all said, why does that matter? Well, something else that you can do with these is you can actually combine the materials. For example, this little one, I put a big splotch of pink in the middle, right around the design, because I didn't want it to shrink. Then, because it's so small, I covered it with one layer of white to make it very stiff, and then an outer layer of gold. Now, I was really just playing with this, honestly. But if you have very flat designs, something like this one, for example, you may want to have a much stiffer mold, because then you can increase the amount of clamping pressure, you can increase the amount of injecting pressure, and lower the temperature of the wax. The wax, if it's at a lower temperature, will cool faster, and therefore you're making molds or making injections much faster. In instances where you have a design that's really design heavy, you may want to have just gold because it will expand during the vulcanizing process and fill in those details really nice. And because it's so soft, you can then pry it out of those details really easily. So this all sounds great, but how do you do it? Well, that's where this thing comes in play. This is called a Vulcanizer. And it's very simple. It's basically just a giant panini press. It heats from the top and the bottom plate, and then this big monster screw on top applies a ton of pressure. You put your mold inside the mold frame, and you put a couple of plates on the top and the bottom, and that compresses it and cooks it essentially, and you get a nice mold. But if you don't have a vulcanizer, or you just don't need one, there are other ways that you can go about this. The most important thing is the heat and the pressure. If you can find a mold frame and plates and contain them at a high enough pressure, you could, in theory, put this into, say, an oven. Now, something to note, though, going that route, is that this rubber requires very exact temperatures. So bear that in mind if you go the DIY route. One of the major drawbacks, aside from all this toolage that you'll need extra to make these molds, is the master itself needs to be made of a very hard material that can survive under this kind of pressure at this kind of high heat. So, for example, you need to have it made out of metal. Ideally, say you make your master out of silver, or maybe you make it in wax and then you cast it and then you take a mold. There are extra steps involved. So that's one of the major downsides. So you can't do organic material like wood or bone, claws, or even 3D prints. So most 3D prints aren't designed to handle that kind of heat at that kind of pressure for that long. Now, there are engineered examples of resin that can do it. Just make sure that you buy the right one, because you'll have a pretty serious failure if you don't. But never fear, because there is an alternative material that we can work with that addresses many of those problems on this side. So over here we have what's called RTV, or room temperature vulcanizing silicon material. These are typically mixed from two parts. You have a part A and a part B, which is the catalyst. Depending on which brand you get, what the purpose is, there's all sorts of factors that go into it, but you will mix these parts differently according to what you're doing. This one requires, I believe, 10:1, which is why the bottles are different sizes. You only need a little bit of this material. Actually, I've written it down on the side, so I don't have to remember for making this work. After you have weighed it out using a very accurate scale, something like this, then you mix it up, and then you have to vacuum it. This is kind of where that extra tool comes into play, like the Vulcanizer. A little inconvenient, but it's necessary. However, if you're a caster, you probably already have a vacuum handy, which is great. So you can use that tool for something else other than casting. So Castaldo also makes RTV materials. However, like I mentioned before, their brand has moved and it's become very hard to get. So I had to move over to this stuff by Freeman. This one's actually really is clear. It looks kind of like this. You can actually see the wax being injected into the mold, which is really cool. You can see beforehand if you have any problems, and then you can make adjustments accordingly. The one that we were typically using before they moved was called Liquicast, and it's this pink one here. Now, Liquicast is not actually RTV. It's a more of a natural rubber material, and as such, it has a few drawbacks, which is why I would recommend, if you get into this, go to the RTV silicon, not natural rubber stuff. This one was one of the first ones we ever made, and it's actually getting really spongy. This particular material needs to be kept in a sealed container for its entire life, basically, or else it gets very soft. This one has been stored properly, and it's much more firm, which is good. When it gets too soft, you just can't hold your detail anymore, and then they're useless, and you have to make a new mold, which is definitely one of the biggest drawbacks with going this route, because you have to be able to weigh it accurately. If you get your proportions off, you may have to scrap the entire thing. So something else to note is that you do need a different kind of mold frame for doing this. As I mentioned before, this is the vulcanized one. These are typically machined out of solid bricks of aluminum because they have to withstand a lot of pressure and heat. This one is an RTV mold frame. Aluminum again, but much thinner on the sides with glass and then just simple clamps. Because RTV is a cold room temperature process, you essentially just kind of mount your piece in this little dome here on the bottom. It hovers in the middle, you pour your stuff on top, and then you let it set, typically over about 24 hours, and then you cut it open. So unlike the vulcanized molds, with the RTV, you can do more natural materials. Say you wanted to do wood, you could do claws. Real life example, there's a bear claw. My partner's family, they're hunters, and they got a bear and they gave this to us. We took a mold. Or 3D prints, which is more up our alley. This is actually the first time I've ever used the Freeman stuff. I was really ambitious with this one, so that's why it's full of bubbles. I had no idea what I was doing. But it turned out okay anyway. These are 1911 scales, the right and the left side. And this is directly from a 3D print. Turned out really, really well. So one of the aspects that both of these materials share is once you made the mold, how do you get the thing out from the middle? Well, this is where the cutting comes in handy. Now with vulcanized, there is the option. You can use this stuff here. This is called separation cream. And what you do is after you stacked your mold, you can put a layer of this in between. And you put these brass mold locks in the corners, vulcanize as per usual. When it comes out of the mold, you have your piece, basically. You don't have to do any cutting. Now there is a downside to doing this. Depending on your design, you may end up with something kind of like this, where it's all uneven. Depending on your design, I've found there's quite a bit of movement that's going on in there, and it's just not very good. Now, also to note is that this type of connection is not very solid. It's best to cut because then you get these little ridges, and these help make sure that it locks together perfectly every time. There's no shifting. And it also creates a really nice seal so that you get less flashing when you inject and cast ultimately. This is the better way to go, I find. Now cutting is dangerous. I am using a non-sterile surgical blade here. It's a very aggressive looking blade. This is a number, what is this? This is a number 12 blade. It's very, very unforgiving. Like, you need to know what you're doing. If you do go this route, I strongly recommend doing a lot of practice beforehand and see if you can find some extra tools. I generally prefer cutting over the separation cream these days. It just allows you to get a much better seal. You can get really fancy with this and you can do very intricate cuts to ensure that you get a really good injection after you've removed it from the rubber. But I have to reiterate that the cutting is pretty dangerous. It's taken me a very long time to get to the point where I'm even comfortable saying to you guys that this is something that is something I do because actually you can see the difference. My initial cuts when I first started were really, really rough, and nowadays gotten a lot better. So definitely, if you do this route, take your time and do a lot of practice. Watch some videos. Reach out to us. Maybe we'll make some class videos about how to make molds. We'll see. So I know there's a lot of information here and we really only touched on the surface of what they do. But if you're interested in doing this kind of work, again, strongly recommend you reach out to someone who does it already. And if you want to see any more videos about the products that we've mentioned here and how to use them properly, comment below so I know that you're interested. So that's all for this video. I will see you guys in the next one.